Call me, D.
Now before we begin, I'd like to apologize to the family and close friends of Rakie, but more importantly, Rakie himself, for mispronouncing his name as Rakie. No excuses, no ifs, ands, or buts. Let me hold that L. And one more thing, as we get into this part 2, I don't want no one to get confused and lose track of the story. There were a lot of people connected, and sometimes we will dive deeper into those stories. But enough of that talking, let's get into it. Virginia sits at the top of the South and the bottom of the North. So for a long time, the city didn't have its own identity. We've heard stories from Baltimore, Atlanta, DC, and the list goes on. Most of our city's history is lost in graveyards or locked away in a prison. So I don't tell you these stories to glorify the street life. I want the youth of the day to understand who their fathers were, their mothers' fathers were. And we today are descendants of those stories. So if you're a Richmond native, this is what you come from. Because there's a time in history where the streets was the only way out for us, to us, especially when something has kept you fed, protected, warm, and alive, because we all have an instinct to survive. And during these times, everything was about survival. Richmond at War, 1990.
I live through the earls of the browns and flats. Roll on you, go to the street with no code on you. By the time they felt your body, you had mold on you.
So we're picking up from the point of Rakie Cloyd turning 14 years old in September of '84. Then went on to catch his first body on November 4th. He's tied in with the Johnson and Brown gang by now, and social services still has custody of him. So just to verify some facts that we can prove, from the years 1983 up until '84, Eugene led his team of brothers and other associates by distribution of several different drugs, being regarded as drug lords, kingpins, you name it. He also went by Gene, and it was said he was hard to be around, so nobody really hung with him, mostly due to him making you nervous. But not because he was a killer per se, but the man talked bullet fast, always looking around, watching his surroundings like he had some deep sense of paranoia. Now, because of Eugene's incarceration, the second to oldest brother, which is Reginald Johnson, would assume control of the daily operation. The Johnson and Brown gang worked close with each other as a well-oiled machine, sometimes sending customers to different lieutenants depending on the type of money they wanted to spend. Most don't know how big the Blackwell projects were. There was a bottom of Blackwell and there was a top, stretching from Jefferson Davis Highway close to the Mayo Bridge. And there were more than 400 housing complexes, making the point that more than one group of guys can make a lot of money trapping from the same area. Now, there's no real proof that Reginald actually claimed head of the table, but things would get a little out of hand, and not all the blame can be attributed to him, because the streets were, and still is, unpredictable. Trust was a thin line to hold on to, and the dangerous environment they lived in alone spared nobody, which gave them no room for screw-ups. So moving on into the next year of '85, the star Richmond police detective C.T. Woody said verbatim that during '84 and early '85 is when he started hearing the names Rakie and Cloyd, coming from sources he accumulated during the 14 years of homicide investigations. See, at first, those sources, they only talked about Rakie occasionally, whispers in the wind, talks amongst the corner kids on the block. But after that ball dropped in '85, Rakie's name rung bells in the streets. But in doing research, I was given a chance to speak with the friend he grew up with, and he would say, Rakie, he was a quiet soul, a loner, but if need be, there was a few choice guys that he would hang out with. But on the surface, he was just a cool guy, very respectful and nothing close to being a bully. And though he was small, he didn't have that typical little man's complex. If he had a problem with anything you did or said, he'd kindly let you know. And if you knew, you knew. He let it go that instant. But if you didn't, you were, in not so many words, just clumped. And it's said that even while he hustled, Rakie never spoke to anyone about whether he killed someone or not. He wouldn't even speak to his closest friend, Leonidas Brown, aka Lily, about it. Them both were as closed mouths as the person could get, the honorable type, which is rare in today's generation. So the foster care that Rakie was placed under had a deadline to go for his return, but that deadline had passed by the month of March. A big factor in why is the lack of communication between him and his mother, Barbara. And Barbara would make her son's return just that much harder, because she would rather not make first contact with Rakie. But this only made him feel rejected. So in turn, he refused to initiate contact with her. By the month of April, they would say he was doing well, attending school regularly, and he was passing. So in an attempt to keep him close to home, they would try to contact other family members on Rakie's behalf for a place to live. but it's stated inside of a document labeled as confidential. It would say, "At this time, there are no interested relatives willing to assume responsibility of Rakie." So as time goes on, Judge Ruby, who's been overseeing this case from the start, decided to nudge Rakie and his mother towards solving their problems. He recommended that Rakie visit his mother on weekends and eventually extend the visits to week-long stays. And only if the visits worked out, Rakie was able to return to her. And something had to be done, because soon he wouldn't be able to stay with EHS another year. And that reason why would shock the community. So just to recap, Rakie is doing a lot better considering his circumstances. The main goal was to patch it up with his mother, and even attending school was going well for him. But only Rakie alone and maybe a few others knew what he had did last winter. And officials would later say his demeanor nor actions painted the picture of a young boy who had took a life. As a warning for everyone watching, listening, or both, viewer discretion is advised as we get into a very tragic case that isn't quite connected to Rakie, but it does hit close to his new foster home. So I guess you could call it a story within a story. Because 4 months later, during the middle of August, a 15-year-old mentally handicapped girl named Tammy Agee would go missing while under foster care. Now, Rakie didn't live in the same home as Tammy, but both foster homes were owned by the same company, which was EHS. There were also 9 other homes that they supervised, and every single one had numerous reports of child neglect and abuse, reports that were filed 2 years prior to Tammy's disappearance. And this would all unfold after a known convicted sex offender named Jamie Allen Donaldson was allowed to live under the same roof as Tammy Agee. Now, ironically, both Jamie and Tammy lived very similar childhoods, with Tammy's handicap being the bigger difference between the two. Because by the tender age of 3 years old, authorities would have to take Tammy and her younger sister from their mother's custody for neglect, thus beginning her lifelong journey with the system. There were several attempts to have her adopted, but all would fail. So for years she lived at the children's home in Roanoke, Virginia. Then by 15 years old, she was assigned to a group home in Richmond. If you had to watch her grow up, you couldn't help but feel like she was just that little girl that nobody wanted. Now, as for Jamie, who was born in 1966, displayed behavioral problems from a very early age. After losing his mother at the age of 9, his father gave up custody of him to social services in Alexandria, Virginia. And now Jamie will go through the same revolving door of numerous foster homes, where his sometimes violent behavioral problems continue. At an older age, Jamie spent some time in a rehabilitation center but was transferred to Western State Hospital after he attempted to rape a nurse at knife point. Soon, he went back into foster care, but it wasn't long before he ran away, eventually being picked up in Harrisonburg, Virginia for another attempted rape of a 7-year-old girl. Jamie would be a ward of the Department of Corrections for a few years before he was ultimately assigned to the group home in Richmond, where he'd meet 15-year-old Tammy. Two people whose childhood destroyed the chance of a normal life were now intertwined. And now that we know how they got here, it's time I tell you what happened. It's a summer day on August 12, 1985, and Tammy was living in a group home on East End at the time. She had only been there 2 days, so the staff would claim they hadn't noticed or even evaluated how serious her condition was. But it was said by one of Tammy's previous nurses that her condition was so bad that you could compare it to having the brain capacity of a 10-year-old, not able to retain basic knowledge such as remembering her own address. And maybe the lack of care reigned true as well for the rest of the children, because had they done their due diligence on Jamie's background, they'd know that a vulnerable teenage girl would soon be in the hands of a volatile predator. Later in the day, while alongside Jamie, she was given permission to go to the Chimborazo pool, which was only 2 blocks away. It isn't known if he was asked to accompany her or if he volunteered himself. Either way, his intentions were the same, because Tammy, she would never make it to the pool that day. Instead, Jamie kidnapped Tammy, taking her to a heavily wooded area along Dock Street, where he would then sexually assault her. Afterward, he bound her arms, throat, knees, and ankles to a nearby tree, then gagged her mouth, all while she was still alive. She was also used to taking scheduled medication, which if not taken, she could have a seizure, or several. In the meantime, Jamie made his way back to the group home, and there's no information regarding the staff questioning Jamie at all. But the staff would immediately call the police. So as detectives do their best to find Tammy, the public helped as well with large search parties for days, but no one could find her. The two detectives assigned to the case would actually search the exact location where Jamie had left her, but couldn't see her due to the dense woods back in '85, which were a lot denser than they are today. Then 3 weeks later, a man walking his dog found Tammy, but not that he could tell that it was her, because all that would be left were bones, and not all of them were intact. The summer heat would speed up the decomposition, leaving no flesh behind, and the animals who roamed the area ate away at her body parts. And they would say during examining the scene that the only flesh that they found were inside her shoes. The detectives were definitely certain that Jamie had a hand in her death, but not clear-cut evidence tied him to it other than him leaving with her that day. So with no solid suspects, time goes on. In the years after, Jamie had a series of run-ins with the law before being convicted in 1991 of aggravated sexual battery of a 9-year-old girl in Virginia Beach. He then gets out on parole in 1994, but again, he found trouble back in Virginia Beach. He went back to prison in Greensville Correctional to finish the full 15 years. Now, there's no information on why, but Jamie would eventually have a change of heart. Because in early 1998, while Jamie's still in prison, he asked to talk to the police about the murder of Tammy Agee. And in his own words, he said, and I quote, "A person I very much tried to show love to." After confessing to detectives, he was indicted in July of 1998 for first-degree murder, abduction, and rape. He was sentenced to 50 years with 20 suspended for life, while already serving 15 years for the 1991 sexual assault of the 9-year-old girl. But back in 1985, when everything happened, while Rakie Cloyd was still under the group home's care, investigations of the EHS company had begun. Former employees began speaking up. A special grand jury convened, and those who contracted with the company started removing children from the homes. In the end, all 11 homes were closed, and the company was convicted of felony child neglect. The president of the company would be charged with 20 misdemeanors, and this all circles back to the reason Rakie had no choice but to either go back home or go back to the streets. And initially, he chose to go home. The social worker handling Rakie's case, who felt foster care was where Rakie belonged, sent Judge Ruby a memo saying something totally different, which said, and I quote, "We are asking that the foster care commitment of Rakie Cloyd to this agency be terminated and his custody be returned to his mother." Now, attending a court hearing in April, both Barbara Taylor and her son indicated a desire for his return home. And by the end of June, Rakie went home for a week's trial, but never returned to his foster care placement. But it would only be a month before Barbara was back at the courthouse asking the juvenile justice system to take her son away. Again, her request was denied this time, and Rakie, who just had his 15th birthday a month before, returned to the streets indefinitely. By the time the new year of 1986 rolls in, Rakie's name rung even harder. Detective C.T. Whitty, who had accumulated a long list of informants or snitches, would tell him there was a lot of talk going on throughout the streets about how fast Rakie would shoot you. And with him being a teenager, they were surprised about it. In the early months of 1986, Detective Whitty would say at first, Rakie was just a name. It took him and his partner a while to learn his last name. But Whitty's snitches, who updated him regularly, said that he was turning bad and fast. By January, Rakie had officially moved to Chicago Avenue in the Blackwell area on the Southside. A place he once hung out at was now home for the moment. That month, he was arrested for allegedly putting a roll of Pillsbury cookies into his coat at Jay's supermarket, and for simple assault on an employee who tried to stop him. The police officer who arrested him claimed he had a plastic object inside his coat pocket, shaped like a wide cigarette but had a strong smell of weed. The first 2 charges were dismissed in court, and the third was handled by a probation officer. But the streets knew Rakie as someone totally different than what the court records could provide. He wouldn't be back in court until October, and the worried city officials all but wondered, what was he up to? So as Rakie was making himself at home on the South Side, the war between the Johnson and Brown gang and the Flacks hit a new level of violence. On another hot summer day of July 8th, 1986, there was a basketball game going on at the Blackwell Park. Russell Leroy Gray was in attendance along with others who were there in big crowds to watch the game. During the game, a fight broke out between a guy named Robert Wilkes and several others. Robert was accompanied by a friend named Carl Martindale, who both would leave the park together after the altercation, which was enough to say it was over. Well, at least that's what Robert thought. because the dispute continued throughout the evening, and anger with the little hard feelings led to a confrontation happening around 9:30 that night in front of a home on the 1000 block of Maury Street. A rowdy crowd formed around the block, and Carl took it upon himself to pull out a pistol and fire it into the air, having intentions on scaring the crowd away. But another man named Michael Harvey thought Carl was actually shooting at his friends, prompting him to up his own weapon and shoot Carl in the neck. The crowd scatters, and Carl was then taken to the hospital, MCV, where he later died from his wounds. The investigation begins, and Robert would be interviewed by detectives, but he'd either make a mistake or purposely throw an innocent man under the bus, because while getting justice for his friend was his intent, he identified Russell Gray as the one who pulled the trigger, telling officers he saw Russell crouch beside the building, gun in hand, when he heard the shots go off. And during a separate interview, Robert viewed some police photos, and again, he identified Russell as the sole shooter. Russell was then charged with murder, and prosecutors centered the case on his testimony when no other witnesses were brave enough to come forward. So Russell would ultimately plead not guilty, thus taking this case to trial. A trial that would take place the next year of 1987. His fate had been sealed because he would be found guilty by a jury and was sentenced to 52 years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. But why is this situation important? What role does Carl's murder play in this entire war? Well, Russell would see daylight again, and what he does after his release from prison, taking a piece off the board that was more than important to everyone. But Russell's indiscretions wouldn't be a factor for another 3.5 years. So as we mark down Carl Martindale as the 4th victim amid this war, we check back in on Rakie, whose behavior prompted people around him to question his deadly actions. Call me, D.
Yeah, these the realest words I was spit on wax. Bug in the hood, I crawl through the crevices and I slip through the cracks. I live through the earls of the browns and flax. Live through the earls of the main, the range, Rockies and the Marcanes.